Hello, good morning, and welcome to the 111th Learn with Lorna. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres looking after the historic documents of the Highlands of Scotland. We have centres in Inverness, in Wick, in Portree, and in Fort William. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're grateful for that, and thank you, as always, to those of you who have. Nice to see all your messages coming in, as always. Yes, Fiona, I'm feeling better now. Thank you. I turned a corner at the weekend and it's all good now. It's also good to see all your messages because I had a hideous nightmare last night that none of this worked. The tech didn't work. I forgot everything I knew about our collections. It was very stressful. So I'm glad it's going and you're saying hello. Just one little piece of news, which you'll have seen, I'm sure, if you're following us on Facebook. So excited to announce that we can now announce our accreditation award. Accreditation for archives is fairly new. It was started in 2013, as opposed to museums, which have been around since the 1980s. So it's quite a new thing, and it took a lot of work for the team to get to that point. So incredibly proud to be able to announce our accreditation, which just means that we're performing well in all aspects of running an archive service. So from managing our records, how we collect them, how we look after them, and how we give access to them and engage people with them. So really delighted to be able to share that with you. So this is the second in May's theme of faith, spirituality, and belief. Last week we looked at the story of the Free Church, something that's so strongly associated with the image of Scotland and a perception of Scotland, and perhaps particularly of the Highlands and the Islands, although other countries do also have churches that sit alongside that. This week we are looking at a different denomination, one which also has its roots in the UK, but this time in England, the Methodist Church, and specifically the Inverness Methodist Church collection that we hold at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness. I'm always conscious, and I know I will have said this over the last couple of years, but I'm always conscious talking about these subjects that everyone's starting point of knowledge will be different. So there may well be people watching who are very familiar with the Methodist Church or attend the Methodist Church. And there'll be others who have absolutely no knowledge of it at all. So what I thought I would do is start with an overview of the collection, what it contains, and then going on to look at the story of the Methodist Church itself before then coming back to tell some stories from that collection, because I think we need to see the stories in the collection and the historical context in parallel, I think. Now, the collection that we're looking at today is D558, Inverness Methodist Circuit and Church. The Inverness Methodist collection dates from 1777 to 2014 so far, but we have an ongoing relationship with the Methodist Church. And we took the first part of this collection in 1999, but we've taken in numerous additions to it since. And that is the great pleasure as well with these collections and this deposited collection, that if we maintain a conversation with the institution, the family, whoever it is, then it means that we can carry on adding to the collection and telling more of the story as we go forward. It's a substantial collection. It has 10 boxes and also some outsized items as well. And there are various formats within the collection. So predominantly paper, but also photographs, microfilm, DVD, and audio cassettes. And I'm sure I have told the story before of having a colleague who didn't grow up at the same time as me, who asked me how to work a cassette, which I thought was just a very sad story. Imagine not having the joy of untangling a cassette with a pencil. Now, within this collection, there are all the things that you would expect to oversee and manage a church system. There are minutes, cash and account books, records of committees such as bazaars, the manse building committee, and so on. Documents to do with the Sunday school, running properties, organising services, newsletters, baptismal registers, etc. So, as I say, everything you would expect to see from within the admin of running a church. So that's the collection of the collection overview. But what's the story of Inverness Methodist Church? And as I say, I think it's helpful to look at an overview of the denomination, and it's actually one I'm not particularly familiar with. I grew up in the Church of Scotland, so that is a kind of second nature to me to understand how the system works, but I'm not as familiar with the Methodist Church. Now, helpfully, one of the documents in this collection is a booklet entitled A Thousand Tongues, the History of Methodism in Inverness from 1791 to 1963. And I've used that as the predominant source because it was written, using the collection that we hold. But I'll start with an overview of the history of Methodism. And for that, I went to the website for the British Methodist Church, which is www.methodist.org.uk. And it paints a picture of a church whose roots in the 1700s were set against a backdrop of a country divided and a population facing extensive change. We've had the kind of drama and the impact of the Union of 1707 between Scotland and England, the agricultural revolution, which had a huge impact on the geographical spread of the population. It was a time of huge change, and a population that was rapidly expanding and spreading from the UK across the globe. And I hope that's something that's come across in previous talks that I've given. Our wider collections really illustrate that. And as I've said possibly previously, it's my favourite century. There's upheaval of politics, the 1700s. There's the Jacobite revolutions, the Union. There are wars at home and overseas. It's a huge time of exploration, expansion, trade, empire, and all of those letters that I've referred to over the last couple of years from India, from the Caribbean. So it's a time of huge change. And also against that backdrop, a time of huge change in religion, the Evangelical Revival. Now, the Evangelical Revival happened across Europe and the world and across the UK. It was a shake-up of the traditional parish church system, which resulted in the creation of several new denominations and growth in church attendance. So apart from the Free Church, which we've looked at, when we've talked before about the established church, there's a very sort of long-lasting set system of that parish organisation, and the Evangelical Revival kind of threw all that into the air and changed it. And the Methodist Church, or the Methodist movement as it was sometimes called, was one of these new denominations that came out of this period. The names most strongly associated with Methodism that you'll probably be familiar with are John and Charles Wesley. They were Lincolnshire brothers who, while at Oxford University, established a society called the Holy Club, or the Methodists. And the term came from the fact that they had a very methodical way of practicing their religion. There was a regularity in what they did, regular Bible study and prayer, regular fasting, and of course, a strong focus on hymns and practical works. And now I say, of course, there, and I'm aware that might not be obvious to everyone, but they're very famous hymn writers as well. The Wesley brothers went to America, but had an unhappy time there and returned to England in the late 1730s. And they commenced, along with others who had been in that society with them, on preaching tours. And that touring aspect is really key to the Methodists, I think. Because, as I say, what had happened previously was there was very much an established parish system and with a minister that attended that. Whereas the Methodists moved round preaching on a circuit. As I say, absolutely key of taking the church to the people. Societies were formed to hear visiting Methodist preachers, and then classes and bands were formed, encouraging each other in individual journeys and accountability. So that was a way for people to be able to support each other, have Bible studies, encourage individual forward movement and spiritual journey. So the societies that sprung up then formed the Connection. And the Connection is the government of the Connection equates something like the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. This is an annual meeting of a high level to discuss governance and the future of the denomination and what decisions taken on what they stand for and where they're going. Now, originally all of this was part of the Church of England, but gradually it diverged. And it was seen very much as a religion of English origin, although it does obviously have places, participants and audiences, congregations elsewhere. But it's really interesting to see that in those very early years in the 1700s, Scotland and the Highlands were already playing a role in this religion. So I wanted to read to you an extract from that book, the booklet that pulls on the collection we hold. In the south of Scotland, Wesley's personal work usually preceded that of his preachers. He first crossed the border in April 1751, and particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, found influential and sympathetic friends in the high places both of church and society. The preachers coming later built on the foundation he had laid, but in the north, this sequence was significantly reversed. Here, Wesley followed in the footsteps of those who had preceded him, and he could not have had worthier heralds. The pioneer labours of the itinerants in the Highlands were Herculean. The record of the distances they travelled, largely on foot, and the conditions they encountered on their journeys is little less than epic. In the case of Inverness, therefore, we must look not to Wesley, but to men whose names are virtually unknown if we would identify the founders of the society. The task of tracing the source of the Methodist stream is a labour of love, but a difficult one, because of the total lack of documentary evidence within the Inverness circuit itself for those early years. Only from 1776, when the society was already firmly established, do the circuit records afford an unequivocal testimony confirming the witness of connectional sources. In such circumstances, it is clear that the meticulous historical accuracy alone must be allowed to provide the data. The facts speak thus. The Methodist Society in Inverness owes its origins to Christopher Hopper, an itinerant preacher and intimate of Wesley's. He had accompanied Wesley on the latter's tour of Ireland in 1750, and they had entered Scotland together in April 1751 on Wesley's first visit to this country. In 1759, travelling alone, Hopper blazed a trail from Leith up the east coast through Aberdeen to the capital of the Highlands. On this journey, he broke new ground and laid the foundation of the Great Northern or Highland Circuit, which ultimately was to stretch from Aberdeen to Wick, becoming the largest circuit, both geographically and numerically, in Scottish Methodism. So, really interesting that the way it came about in the Highlands was different, but also that from very early on, it was a very popular movement. The country was ready for change and shake-up. Now, there was a Methodist society in Inverness from 1761, which was formally included in the circuit by 1766. In June 1764, John Wesley himself visited Inverness, which I know is something, I don't know if there's any Methodist watching, but it's something that the congregation are still very proud of. John Wesley visited Inverness himself and preached in the old high church. Our collection includes a transcript of his words describing his visit to Inverness. And this is what he said. Sunday, June the 10th, 1764. About 8 we reached Inverness. I could not preach abroad because of the rain, nor could I hear of any convenient room, so I was afraid my coming hither would be all in vain. All ways seemed to be blocked up. At 10 I went to the kirk. After the service, Mr. Fraser, one of the ministers, invited us to dinner and then to drink tea. As we were drinking tea, he asked what hour I would be pleased to preach at. I said, about 5:30. The High Kirk was filled in a very short time, and I have seldom found greater liberty of spirit. The other minister came afterwards to our inn and showed the most cordial affection, and then this is written in capital letters. Were it only for this day, I should not have regretted the riding 100 miles. Then on Monday the 11th, he says, a gentleman who lives 3 miles from the town invited me to his house, ensuring me the minister of his parish would be glad if I made use of his kirk, but time would not permit, as I had appointed to be at Aberdeen on Wednesday. All I could do was preach once again in Inverness. I think the church was fuller now than before, and I could not but observe the remarkable behaviour of the congregation after the service. Neither man, woman, nor child spoke one word all down the main street. Indeed, the seriousness of the people is the less surprising when it is considered that for the last 100 years at least, this town has had such a succession of pious ministers as very few in Great Britain have known. After Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, I think Inverness is the largest town I have seen in Scotland. The main streets are broad and straight, the houses mostly old but not very bad, nor very good. It stands in a pleasant and fruitful country and has all things needful for life and godliness. The people in general speak remarkably good English and are of a friendly and courteous behaviour. At about 11, we took horse to Nairn. And as I say, I know that the congregation here are still really proud of that connection. And he would go on to visit again on subsequent occasions over the next few years. The first Methodist chapel in Inverness was opened in 1770 in a close off Academy Street. It was started in a kiln on a street that was at the time called Kiln Close, and it was a kiln that had fallen out of use following the creation of a malt tax, and the account books that we hold detail this. This was the home that the society would be in until the 1780s, when they moved on to another site on Academy Street, which at the time was called New Street because it had only just been built, before they went in to open the Methodist chapel on the corner of Ingle Street and Hamilton Street. I mentioned the wonderful account books. There are so many of these fantastic account books that detail all sorts of things. They're, well, like all of these things, they're just wonderful to browse through and to get an idea of the context of life. So many receipts for, so many payments for candles, for postage, for horses, and so on. Here's a summary of them from that over 1,000 tongues summary. A quite clear picture of the society emerges from the meticulously kept account books. From Wesley's evidence, the numerical strength of the society can be placed at about 60 members, and it is evident that they met for worship 3 times each Sunday, the first service being at 7 a.m. The society class or classes met regularly throughout the week, the members following the original Methodist custom of donating a penny every time they met in class. In addition, seats and pews were rented. Class tickets were issued quarterly. The pattern of Methodist life has not changed much in 200 years. And to anyone who knows Methodism well, a very little imagination can supply quite accurately details of the worship, discipline, and fellowship of those who met within the kiln. Jen, I'm seeing your question. A kiln is a building for like a manufacturing building, so things like malt, but also bricks and things be hardened in kilns. Inevitably, the accounts are concerned in the main with the expenses of the preachers who travelled in this circuit. From the lists of the names which appear in this brochure, it will be seen that throughout the 18th century, 3 or 4 preachers were responsible for the oversight of the circuit. They followed each other in an endless succession, westward to Inverness and eastward to Aberdeen, never staying with one society for more than 3 months. Thus, while Duncan MacCallum was in Inverness from March to May 1777, William Proctor, his colleague in the circuit, led it from May to July. They boarded during their stay in the town at the cost of 6 shillings per week and were allowed postage, peats and candles as extras. Their personal expenditure was, however, strictly governed by the amount of money raised by the society for collections and class money. Furthermore, it was a matter of honour that each preacher should leave a small credit balance for the use of his successor. I know I have said this so many times over the weeks, but I just love that through looking at any subject, you get such a good idea of the context. So looking at those account books, yes, you're finding out about the Methodist Church, but you're finding out about travel, about work, about, I think we forget how much of life was lived with how life was lived with no electricity. Everything's candlelit. And I think just looking through that kind of volume really brings that to life in a very visual way. Now, one of the things that these account books detail are the costs for the construction and maintenance of new buildings. Maintenance, as always, is a constant concern for anyone running any organisation, I'm sure. The construction of that first chapel on Ingle Street from May 1797 to November 1798 is included in these books. It was a first floor chapel with a shop and a tenanted house below it, and it cost around £440 to build. And this happened under the leadership of Duncan MacCallum, who had been both appointed and ordained by John Wesley, and he was the first Methodist minister in the north. The church's memoir records those next few decades like this. That old building, the Methodist church erected in 1798, was the scene of one of the most pleasing episodes in ecclesiastical history known to the writer. This was written by, no, 2 seconds, I have absolutely jumped ahead of myself, I do apologise. So the church's memoir records what happened after that building was built like this. Inverness was given the important status of a circuit in 1799. And though for some years following more than one preacher was appointed to serve it, it became a single station in 1809 and has remained so up until the present day. During the 70 years under consideration, only 3 societies continued in existence within the circuit: Inverness itself, Dingwall, and Wick. Methodism seems to have disappeared entirely from the Black Isle, and while the Dingwall members received regular visits from the superintendent preacher, the continuance of the cause at Wick depended entirely upon local preachers and class leaders. Nairn, Speyside, and Fort William, where Methodism had been established by Duncan MacCallum and Robert Dahl, find no place in the circuit schedules, and the societies there must be presumed to have ceased to exist. So it's an interesting insight into the way all religions and all movements form and shape themselves. So there's a huge growth. Then there's a slight waning in certain areas. Engagement dies away in some places, but some continued to grow, especially in Inverness, which at certain points had numerous classes running at the same time, especially at one particular time in history, which I'll come back to. And in the early 1800s, the Methodists moved apart from the Church of England. And then throughout the 19th century, there were, you'll be unsurprised to hear, like all religions, there were various schisms and splits and reunions amongst those various nonconformist churches. And it's in this period that the Salvation Army and others have their roots. A really interesting aspect of Methodist life that I found incredibly interesting was exactly that, the extent to which their faith and religion was tied in to, or is tied in, genuinely intertwined with the rest of their lives. And this really came to prominence in the 1800s. So Methodists attend church on a Sunday, as you can see there from that extract, which talked about the 3 services on a Sunday. But also there were midweek services for worship, but also a real focus on social get-togethers in groups and in gatherings, both for religious things like Bible study, but also for things like dances, singing, just a real community aspect. There was also a clear and dedicated link to politics in this period, liberal politics and also the Labour Party and the trades unions. Keir Hardie, so I've been going, don't say Keir Starmer, because that's the one you hear in the news all the time. Keir Hardie, although I believe that's exactly who Keir Starmer was named after. But Keir Hardie, who founded the Labour Party, was a Methodist preacher, and there is still a Keir Hardie Methodist Church in London in the Canning Town area. Nye Bevan, Aneurin Bevan, who founded the NHS, a prominent member of the party, was also brought up by a Methodist father. So there's that link between Methodism and Labour and liberal politics. And addition, so those connections to the trade unions and the working classes also informed the party's strong focus on social issues, things like poverty and homelessness and alcoholism. Now, as we know from previous sessions last week, 1843 was the year of the disruption, creating the Free Church. But it's interesting that from a Methodist point of view, that year saw a striking collaboration across church denominations in Inverness. And this is the extract I started to read to you too early. This was written by Alexander Ross, who was a very famous architect and the subject of a previous Learn with Lorna. And he said this: That old building, the Methodist church erected in 1798, was the scene of one of the most pleasing episodes in ecclesiastical history known to the writer. It occurred at the disruption of 1843 and was related to him as a child, with feelings of emotional thankfulness by a saintly relative. So Alexander Ross has been told this by a relative who remembers it happening. Inverness in that stirring year had, as elsewhere, its ecclesiastical upheaval, and among others, the present United Free High Church sprang into being. Its founders had, of course, no local habitation, so we spoke about that last week, the fact that all these churches sprung up and they had no buildings to worship in. In the keenness of feeling that was then rampant, doors were shut against them, which might at the time availed for a temporary resting place. So everywhere they tried to worship, they were kicked out of and refused entry. In the difficulty, the minister and officials of the Methodist Church, ready then as they are ever to forward the interests of relating to the interests of higher things, invited that infant congregation to the use of the chapel at the off hours of their own Sabbath work. The invitation was gladly accepted, and the kindly neighbourliness existed for a considerable time, and up to this day there is an undercurrent of affection between the two congregations, which has more than once manifested itself in joint services with the Free High Church. What is true of one congregation in the town is true of others, for the Methodist people have ever cultivated in their perfection in Inverness the arts which make for peace towards all denominations. What they were in past days, so they still are. So a real focus there on ecumenical, supporting other denominations and not being kind of confrontational in that. And it was interesting when I looked through those early records, they're talking about the fact that even when Wesley came and various other people, they don't want to interfere with the established church. They don't want to preach at the same time and cause conflict. It's more being at another time, so they're not causing offence. Now, in 1867-68, that Ingle Street chapel that I mentioned was demolished just at the end of the ministry of a Reverend John Drake, which I thought I would put in for you, John. And a new chapel was built on the same site, and that was needed because at that point capacity was so high. And this chapel that was built again on that same site of Ingle Street served for 54 years until 1922, and then also until 1928 as a Sunday school. But the congregation by that point had acquired the music hall in Union Street for £4,200, where they went on. And at this point, the Inverness Methodist Circuit became the Inverness Mission. That Ingle Street building is much loved, and especially the beautiful stained glass rose window. So Rod, I'm glad to see that you're saying you remember that round window. I knew somebody would have would comment about that, because it is something that is held very close to the hearts of the people of Inverness, that rose window. It was gifted by Mr. James Keith of Dingwall, a friend to the church. The window stayed in the building when the chapel was sold and became a cafe, but was later put into storage, where it has been for decades, since the Eastgate construction in the 1970s, 80s. But it is now being taken out of storage to be included in the transformation of Inverness Castle, which I've spoken about in a previous Learn with Lorna. But it's I think of all the announcements about the Inverness Castle development that have been made, I think that's one that people are so pleased about, knowing that that rose window is coming back out of storage and being on display in the town again. The congregation, as I say, moved to Union Street, to a music hall building, and they stayed in that building until 1961, which meant that they were there for a very notable period in Methodist history. See how this is. This was the official date of the establishment of the Methodist Church in Britain in 1932. Now, it seemed so strange to me, having looked at centuries of its history before and after various reunions, including it in 1907, 1932, but those roots in the 1700s, to find out that the official establishment date of the Methodist Church in Britain is 1932. So there you go. And at this point, the Inverness congregation were worshipping in the Union Street building. Around this time, the congregation grew substantially under the ministry of Reverend John Reed. In the 1930s, the evening congregation numbered over 700, and the Sunday school over Sunday school overflowed to around 250 children. So a very big congregation, especially during the Second World War, where there were numerous special services and social events for the troops who were stationed in Inverness. The hall had, it's interesting, there are some memories of when they moved from the chapel in Ingle Street with that beautiful rose window to the building on Union Street, which they needed because they were at capacity. And so they were pleased to move to a building which could accommodate them, but a sadness at the fact that the chapel had been so beautiful and they were moving into a music hall, which was very bare and not very conducive to worship. But under John Reed's ministry, they went around changing and elaborating the building. And they had an organ put in, which was apparently one of the most famous in the country, a very beautiful organ. And also, which I loved, the most comfortable and attractive cinema seats were installed. So you'd think that would be something they would have left over from the music hall, but no, they specifically had cinema seats put in, which I love. In 1961, I said they were in that building until 1961, and that was because a tragic event ended the role of that building in the Methodist story. On the night of the 5th and 6th of December, a fire completely destroyed the premises, the organ, everything. And it was described as being like the loss of a home, leaving deep regret in the hearts of very many people. While the fire was still being put out, the trustees met and they pulled in 12 additional new trustees at this moment as well. And they immediately started the process of planning for a new church in Huntley Street, which opened in 1965 and remains there to the present day, where the church continues to operate, the congregation continues to worship and adapt with things such as the ordination of women in 1974 and various other changes. So as I say, from those early roots in the 1700s, right at the beginning of Methodism, Inverness was in there and still a presence in the town today. So I hope you have enjoyed that sort of whistle-stop tour of Inverness Methodism. If you are a member of the church, please comment, please tell me if I've got anything wrong or if that I've represented your faith correctly. I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you for being with me. Reminder again that I'll be taking a break over the summer, so we'll be back on the 1st of September. So I'll run through till the end of May, so a couple still to do, and then back on the 1st of September. And I've advertised that one today on the 1st of September. We'll be looking back at an old favourite of stories in school logbooks. Reminder again that if you want to, during that summer period of those 3 months that I will be doing other things, if you want to go back and watch all the previous Learn with Lornas will be on YouTube indefinitely. We've gone from a denomination, so last week the Free Church, this week we've gone to a specific church of the Inverness Methodist Church. Next week we'll be looking at one person in a religious context, Principal Emeritus John MacLeod, which is a fantastic collection which my colleague and I were saying yesterday, so far hasn't been plumbed to its depths, we don't think. So a great collection. And then the last one in May will be looking at superstitions, belief and spirituality. A reminder in the meantime that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. And I'm sorry you're devastated, Jen. I'll still be doing things. Don't worry. Thank you.